Consider a tower, built to watch, raised on law. Faelen's tower did not fall. No alarms rang, no walls were breached. A captain rode away, and it was handed over. Men simply chose warmth, closeness, and freedom over vigilance. Dawn arrived over Faelen's tower, and Rellan Voss had been awake for most of it already. He stood on the eastern walk with his hands resting on the stone and his breath ghosting faintly before him. He watched the sky above the low fields and the darker line of trees beyond. The tower was still new enough that the stone smelled different when the air was damp. Not old dust and lighten yet, it had a cleaner, quarried scent. Lord Calder had wanted it to feel solid and enduring, and Rellan supposed it did. Below him the yard lay quiet as a couple of lanterns burned low near the gate. The men who had come on duty with him were mostly locals drawn from Faelen's watch itself. He knew their names, their habits, and which ones would complain about the cold as well as those who would not even notice it. He had grown up with some of them, with others he had shared ale, debts, or small favours. The watch captain liked to remind them that they now served Calder's law as well as their own good sense, but it was the latter that still seemed to matter more. Rellan told himself he was tired because the watch rotation had been altered again. Footsteps sounded behind him, but he did not turn. He already knew that rhythm. "You're favouring your right foot," said Jotam, coming to stand beside him. Jotam had joined the watch only a season after Rellan, and though he was broader in the shoulder and quicker to laugh, he shared Rellan's habit of noticing small things and worrying about them longer than was useful. "It's colder on this side. The stone keeps it, so I move." Jotam leaned on the parapet and looked out toward the fields. "You'd think they'd have finished the outer wall by now. Calder promised." "Calder promises a lot of things," Roman said, an edge creeping into his voice. Durton glanced at him. "You all right?" Rellan nodded. "Just didn't sleep much." "'Cause of them?" Roman could see the low shapes of the temperate dwellings that had sprung up near the base of the tower over the last few weeks. Tents at first, then lean-tos, then something closer to huts, though built oddly, with angles that did not quite square with entrances that seemed to turn away from the eye. Smoke curled up from one of them now, carrying a scent that was not wood alone. Below, a door creaked open and someone laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the morning air. Rellan found his attention snagging on it. The arrival of Belnoric Rootcaster and his followers had been quiet. A small procession at first, men and women alike, non-armed in any obvious way. Their carts were light and their manner deferential. They presented their papers to Captain Ven with careful respect. They had permission, it was true, to reside near the tower for a time, to conduct observations and advise. The words had been precise, but without being terribly clear. Rellan had been on gate duty that first evening. He remembered Rootcaster's eyes, dark and oddly reflective. He remembered the way the man's followers had watched as well, taking everything in and finding it all worth noting. "You'll find we keep our hours differently," Rootcaster had said, "but we'll try not to trouble yours." They had troubled them anyway, though never directly. Watches were disrupted because someone had overslept or volunteered to trade. Men loitered at the parapets when they should have been relieved. Tasks were completed, but without the old sense of urgency. Rellan could not have said when it began, only that it had. A shout rose from the yard as the relief watch assembled. Captain Ven emerged from the tower door, looking markedly older than he had when he had arrived from Calder, even though it had been less than a year. Rellan descended the stair and joined the others as they gathered. The captain ran through the formalities quickly, his tone efficient but distracted. When he dismissed them, some of the men drifted toward the cookhouse, others toward the gate. Rellan hesitated, then found himself walking instead toward the edge of the encampment. One of Rootcaster's people was awake there, a woman seated on a low stool. She sat close to a fire, and the light from it shaped her. She was young, with black hair that fell loose down her back. Her face was fine-boned, the sort that did not need stillness to be striking. The fire caught the lines of her body through the cling of her clothing. She sat easily, her posture unashamed of its own presence. Rellan had become acutely aware of her warmth, the way her breath lifted her chest and the long line of her neck exposed where her hair slipped aside. The sight of her stirred something in him, not tender or romantic, but a blunt, bodily want that surprised him with its force. He told himself it was fatigue after a long watch, causing his mind to wander. Yet, when she looked up at him with those dark eyes, he felt a certainty that she knew exactly what had passed through him, and that it pleased her. "Morning," she said, as an old acquaintance might. "Morning," Rellan replied, and then he stopped, uncertain what he had meant to say next. "You're early." "I've been on watch." "So you have," she said, and smiled. "Do you always stand so high to greet the day?" "Someone has to." "Of course, someone always does." She made room on the bench beside her, without explicitly inviting him to sit. Rellan remained standing, aware suddenly of his boots and the mud on the hem of his cloak. He realized with a flush of embarrassment that he had thought about how he looked before he thought about why he had come. "What is it you're doing here?" She stared into the fire, watching, listening, waiting. "For what?" "For when things show themselves." Rellan frowned. "We're here to watch, that's our purpose." "Yes, I know." She resumed her hunting. Rellan became aware of how tired he was, a weariness unconnected with the night just past. He thought of how long it had been since he had stood anywhere without knowing exactly what was expected of him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Have Urinai," she said. "And yours?" "Rellan Voss." She smiled again. "You've lived here a long time?" "All my life." Then this place is part of you, more than you might think." "It's a tower and some fields." "And is that all it's ever been?" "I should go," he said. Urinai nodded. "You'll still be here." By the time Rellan reached the cookhouse, the others were already eating. Jotem waved him over, making space on the bench. Someone slid a bell towards him, and Rowan ate mechanically, his thoughts still hooked on the encounter. "You look like you've been somewhere else," Jotem said, around a mouthful of bread. "Just tired." "That's becoming your answer for everything." Before Rellan could respond, Captain Ven entered, his presence quieting the room. He took a cup from the shelf and poured himself ale, though it was barely past dawn. "Listen," he said, addressing everybody. "Rootcaster has asked permission to conduct a small observance at the tower's base this morning. It's within his remit, so no interference, keep your distance." Murmurs rippled through the room, and someone swore. "What kind of observance, sir?" Jotem asked. Ven thought a moment. He didn't specify. Rellan felt a flicker of irritation. "With respect, Captain, this is our watch." When Ven replied, his voice was tired. "And Calder's authority," he said, "which he carries, we do our duty by recognizing that." Rellan subsided, though the unease remained. They assembled again in the yard not long after. Rootcaster and his followers gathered near the tower's base. They marked the ground with chalk and ash. Patterns meant nothing to Rellan even as his eyes tried to follow them. Some of the watch stood with arms folded, others leaned on their weapons, but all of them silent. Rootcaster then raised his voice and began to speak strange words and to chant. Rellan found himself listening despite himself, his thoughts now drifting. He next became aware of Alurani standing near to him, though he had not seen her approach. She came close and held on to his arm. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "Hear what?" "The way the tower listens." Beln frowned. "It's stone." "Stone listens. It remembers everything." He wanted to argue. Instead, he found himself watching Rootcaster trace a hand along the tower's wall, his fingers moving in a way that made Rellan feel uncomfortable. The sun rose fully, light striking the tower's upper courses and turning them pale gold. The observance ended without any clear conclusion. Rootcaster bowed slightly toward the watch, thanked Captain Ven for his forbearance, and withdrew. The men dispersed, some grumbling, others thoughtful. Rallard remained where he was for a moment longer, thinking about Alurani's words and her touch. That afternoon he missed the signal call, not deliberately. He had been standing at his post watching the road when he realized he had been thinking of Alurani's humming and the way it had calmed him. The whole lay at his side, untouched. Jotem had covered the call for him. "You're drifted," Jotem had said later, concerned for his friend. "So are you," Rellan replied. Jotem just looked away. Maybe. Rellan returned from the second dawn watch with the taste of curled still in his mouth. The tower behind him was already stirring, but he found his feet carrying him away from it. The encampment lay quiet at this hour, its low scratchers holding the last of the night, reluctant to let it go. Alurani's dwelling stood apart from the others, a small structure raised from timber frames and clad in layered hides and woven reed panels. The seams were stitched tight against wind and sound. It had been set carefully, its back to a shallow rise and its entrance angled away from the tower itself. The narrow shuttered opening near the roof let out a thread of smoke, and the door hanging on pegs was closed. He paused there longer than he meant to, aware of how foolish he must look standing there in silence. She spoke before he announced his presence. "You can come in," he said. It was almost as though she had been expecting him. Rellan hesitated, then pushed the flap aside and ducked through. The space within was warmer than he expected. The air held the mingled scents of smoke and something sweeter. Alurani stood near the fire, barefoot, her hair unbound, wearing a loose linen smock that hung from her shoulders. "You shouldn't," he said, and heard how unconvincing it sounded even to himself. She looked at him with those dark eyes. "You're finished for the morning?" "That doesn't mean—" "I know what it means," she replied, "and what it doesn't." An awkward silence stretched between them. Rellan became acutely aware of his hands, unsure where to put them, and of the dull thud of his heart. She stepped nearer, not touching him, only closing the distance until he could see the rise and fall of her chest. Then, without looking away, she reached up and drew the shift over her head. For a moment, Rellan could not move. The firelight traced her in soft contours, revealing the easy strength of her body, the gentle swell of her breasts, the curve of her hips, and the long, easy lines of her legs. There was nothing coy in the way she stood. She neither posed nor shielded herself, and that openness struck him harder than any display might have done. Desire rose in him with a sudden, undeniable urgency. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." That was enough. Whatever words might have followed seemed unnecessary. He stepped forward to meet her, and the rest unfolded as such things do when thought gives way to instinct. When he emerged later into the daylight, Batar loomed as it always had, but Faelen knew that something in him had already slipped and would not be set back so easily. The seventh dawn came clear and pale, and Faelen was on the western walk when he saw Captain Ven riding out alone. His helm was uncrested, and his posture rigid in the saddle. There was no escort, no call to assemble, no word passed to the men on duty. Faelen watched until the figure diminished and the sound of hooves was swallowed by the distance. Only then did he realize how quiet the tar had become. No one remarked on the absence, no one even asked where the captain had gone, or when he might return. Below, the encampment was already stirring. Fires burned openly now, and figures moved between the dwellings. Some of the watchmen drifted down from the tower unarmed and without their cloaks, greeting Rootcaster's people by name. Others did not leave the tower at all, but instead returned with company, laughter echoing oddly in stairwells meant for orders and alarms. Faelen passed the doorway on the second level and caught a glimpse of two bodies entwined on a pallet meant for one. He recognized the watchman by the scar on his face. The woman beside him was another of Rootcaster's followers, her dark hair loose, her hand resting with casual ownership on the man's chest. Neither looked ashamed. The door closed before Faelen could think to turn away. In the yard, Jotem stood talking with a woman he had never brought into the tower before. His hand rested at the small of her back as though it belonged there. When he noticed Faelen watching, he only smiled and shrugged as if to say that this too was now ordinary. Faelen descended the stairs. He crossed the yard and followed the familiar path toward the encampment, moving toward what felt now inevitable. Aluranai was seated on the low bed inside her dwelling, her hair loose, her expression calm. His arrival was neither surprise nor triumph. He removed his cloak and set it aside, the gesture feeling strangely final. He lay beside her, the contact unadorned and deeply certain. There was comfort in the closeness and the absence of instruction. This was what he wanted, or at least what he no longer wished to resist. Outside, the sounds of the encampment rose and fell, voices blending, laughter threading through the morning air. While the tower above filled with new occupants and looser rules, Rootcaster moved through its upper chambers alone. He entered Captain Ven's quarters and found that the room was neat and orderly, with the bed made and the table cleared of anything personal. Captain Ven had left nothing behind that mattered to him. Rootcaster set a small object at the center of the table. It glowed, a green light pulsing softly from within. He immersed himself in it for a moment, his expression thoughtful but soon changing to a private, satisfied smile. Outside, the tower stood whole against the morning sky, its purpose intact in stone, if not in spirit now. The watch still wore its colors, the road still lay open, but by the time the sun cleared the fields, Faelen's tower no longer belonged to the men who had been set to keep it, and no one thought to ask when that happened. The greatest losses are not taken by force. They are given away, piece by piece, by those who mistake comfort for safety and permission for authority. When vigilance becomes optional, the watch is already over.